I see that neither the gospel nor the Bible in its entirety or the Constitution have been sacred enough to protect the rights of all people.
I'm Mitch.
And I'm Missy.
We're co-workers.
He's the boss, and we're married.
And she's the boss. Together, we host Good Faith Weekly, a podcast on faith and culture.
What could possibly go wrong?
Tune in and find out. Missy. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, you just get me this week. Missy's still feeling a little bit under the weather, and since it is the holiday break, we're going to give you a very special episode of Good Faith Weekly. You're going to get two incredible interviews. The first interview Missy and I conducted a few months ago with the remarkable Dr. Susan K. Smith, and we really know you're going to enjoy that interview. And then later on afterwards, one of our contributing correspondents, Laine, sits down with Dr. João Chaves, and they have a delightful conversation. And so we know that you're going to really enjoy these two interviews. And then next week, Missy and I will be back with a regular episode of Good Faith Weekly, and we will be recording from a remote location. So we cannot wait to be back in the saddle, back with you and bringing you Good Faith Weekly again. So enjoy these two great interviews, and we will see you next week. Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Dr. Susan K. Williams Smith has formed a private, not-for-profit organization aimed at empowering urban youth all over the United States through improved literacy. Susan K. Smith Ministries is operating as Crazy Faith Ministries, aiming to worship through service. Her blog, Candid Observations, concentrates on the intersection of race, politics, and religion. Dr. Smith is the author of Forgive Who? The Struggle to Obey God's Awful Command, Crazy Faith, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives, the Book of Jeremiah, the Life and Work of Jeremiah Wright, Rest for the Justice, Seeking Soul, and Carla and Annie, a children's book. She is a former news reporter and talk show host. She is our guest today to discuss her most recent book, With Liberty and Justice for Some, the Bible, the Constitution, and Racism in America. Dr. Smith, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thanks for taking the time out. I mean, good night. All this work that you're doing, you're the executive director of Crazy Ministries and just doing so much work. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Smith. I want to start out talking a little bit about the most recent book that Mitch mentioned and talk about what compelled you to write this specific book. I believe you wrote it in 2020 during a pandemic and, upon the social uprising after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So aside from the obvious, what prompted you to write this particular book about the Bible, the Constitution, and racism?
Well, thank you for the question. And I think what really compelled me was a deep sadness. In the book, I talk about the Bible and the Constitution being two sacred documents, the two sacred documents in this country. And what I have come to see and realize and understand is that neither the Bible or the Constitution, for the most part, have been used to treat all persons as equal, to make sure that all people, have the rights that the gospel, according to Jesus, I'm a Christian, so I go by the gospel. It seems that although a lot of people call themselves Christian, historically, when you read through the book, you see all these people who, from the very beginning, just kind of pushed Jesus to the side.
Sure.
And it made me sad. It made me sad because if you don't have protection from the two sacred documents and the people in power claim to love and to honor both sacred documents while they are effectively using them to marginalize more the already marginalized, that just makes me very sad. It makes me very sad. I can remember when I was in high school taking civics, it was a requirement. I hear kids don't have to take that anymore, but taking civics and learning about the three branches of government and how I just felt a sense of calm and reassurance that all of the stuff we heard about that went on in other countries would never happen here. So I had some confidence in that, and I had confidence in the judicial system because of the way it was explained. All of that, all of that. But as I have grown and watched and seen what's going on, I see that neither the gospel nor the Bible in its entirety or the Constitution have been sacred enough to protect the rights of all people. So it made me sadness. It was just sadness.
Yeah. And, as I was working through the book, which is just outstanding, now that you say that, I could feel in your writing, there was a soulfulness to it, and you may describe it as sadness, but there was a lot of emotional descriptions as you were working through the material itself. And so that makes a lot more sense as I read the Bible now, knowing and understanding where you were coming from as you wrote it. So thank you for that answer. Now, in the first chapter, you discuss how we got to the point when it comes to racism in America. You began by taking readers back to the 15th century and Elmina, Ghana, West Africa, which, believe it or not, I have been there multiple times. Yes. So when I read this, it was like, I could see the image of the castle, the dungeons. I could smell the dungeon smell, because in one dungeon they have left it completely unwashed over the centuries, and just that rancid smell that these individuals, these human beings, had to live in. And then, of course, staring up at the governor's room as he would have all the women that were being captured for slavery. He would have them in the courtyard, and he would pick one, and they would have to go through this door up to the governor's castle. So, when you mentioned that, it was like, oh, you took me right back there. So by mentioning the castle in Elmina, which is a Portuguese castle run by Catholics, and then it was turned over, and then in the 17th century, it turned from a fortification to a slave castle. Why is it important for us to study and understand these horrific moments of history?
It's important because we don't connect with pain, because it's not pleasant to connect with pain. We don't connect with painful memories, and we don't connect with criticisms of ourselves or of our country, because it's just easier not to. People who have been brutalized, you can be a Black person brutalized, you can be a woman who's been brutalized, any person who's been brutalized many times, you find that they will never talk about it. It's too painful. It's just too painful. And I think in not talking about it, it makes other people feel more comfortable. Mm-hmm. Because when we talk about it, it makes us uncomfortable, and we in turn make other people uncomfortable. And so I think that this country has been able to stay away from its history and not talking about it, not teaching about it, because it makes everybody uncomfortable. That's what the fight is around CRT. It's what they're wanting to stop is the recitation of history. Yeah. They don't want people to know how bad it has been. Like Ron DeSantis said, that we don't live on stolen lands, and you shouldn't teach that because it's inappropriate and it's wrong. But it is absolutely right. And to teach that story, we never heard about that. I don't know about you. We never heard about the Trail of Tears. We never heard about any of that in school. And so it's just easier not to look at it, not to hear about it. Then we can pretend, that everything's okay. So we have stood on this myth of American exceptionalism, which has never existed. And we have stood on this myth of this democracy being the most fair and wonderful democracy in the world. And it has not been. And it's just easier to do that. And people just don't want to have to come face to face with the truth. So when you go to Elmina, and Mitch, it does something to you. Mm-hmm. And I always tell this story because, I took my kids. My son was, I think he was 15 when we went, and my daughter was 17. I think I've got the age range, but they're in that range. And so we had gotten there early in the day. We were doing a concert, and we had gotten there early in the day, and we toured the castle, and then we didn't. And I hate the word castle even, but we toured the facility,
Right.
and then we went back to rest to prepare for the concert that evening. And then I wanted to go back. I just wanted to go back. I just needed to inhale something, and I was going. I wasn't taking anybody with me, and my son said, I want to go with you, which was surprising, 15-year-old kid. And we went, and when we got there, he distanced himself from me, and he just walked around, and I saw him. I watched him. He would go to different places, and he would just stand, and like he was trying to absorb something too. So we sang that night, and when I looked up and saw that cross, that church on top of that dungeon, and I broke down. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw him crying. I saw a lot of people, but it was strange because 15-year-old kids. What? So we got home, and it was maybe a month later, and he came into my room. It was this Christmas season, and he said, "Ma, I have something to tell you." Now, this is a 15-year-old boy. And a 15-year-old boy comes into your room with this serious face and says, I have something to tell you. I immediately went to, oh, shoot, he's made somebody pregnant. I thought, I mean, you know
yeah.
what?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And he said, I've already talked to Dad. That just made me all
yeah, right.
worried. And he sat down. He said, I just wanted to tell you, I don't want anything for Christmas. And I said, well, that's interesting. Why? And this, you have to understand that my son is a kid that started making out his Christmas list in August, and he edited it, so that he would be, perfected. But tears rolled down his face, and he just said, Africa, and he walked out the room. That's the pain that none of us want to come face to face with. We don't want to face that. We don't want to touch it. We don't want to feel it. We don't want to think about it. So if we can remain ensconced in myths that have been built up to justify the racism, then we will do that. Black people and white people will all do that because it makes it easier to live on a day-by-day basis.
That is such an important point. You mentioned the Trail of Tears. I'm a Muskogee Creek. And so, because through my ancestral stories, I got to hear the stories of indigenous people and the oppression and the stolen lands that America was built on. But you know what I didn't hear, Dr. Smith? I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I heard the story of Greenwood and Black Wall Street.
That's what I'm saying. It's too painful.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder if DeSantis has ever heard that story. I wonder if any of these clowns that are spewing all this hatred have ever heard that story. Because like you, people who live in Tulsa, I know people who have PhDs, and they'll say, I never knew about that. And they lived there. They went to school there. The same thing in Forsyth, Georgia, or Rosewood, Florida, or East St. Louis, Illinois. I mean, all of these massacres that happened, and nobody talks about them. The white people, because whatever, but the Black people, because it's too painful to remember that people they loved were snatched from them. And many times they were forced out of town. They were forced out of their homes. And it's just too painful. They can't do it.
You talk about the struggle between what you call the religion of creation versus the religion of empire. Can you define those for our listeners and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, religion of creation is what Jesus, the Christ, talked about. He didn't do denominations and all that stuff. There was no Protestant, Catholic, and all that. And so, and I have had people get angry at me when I have said that Jesus was a Jew. I've had good Christians get angry at me when I have said that there's Jesus was a Jew. He's a Jew. No, he wasn't. He was a Christian. Okay, but what Jesus wanted. From my reading of the Gospels, what Jesus wanted more than anything was for people to live in community, and there's strength in community. So if we take it for granted or absorb what we've been taught, that God is sovereign and God created everything that was created, then God wanted all of these different entities, these different humans, these different humanities, these different ethnicities to live in concert. That was a whole new way of looking at life. That's what Jesus, he says, I didn't come to break the law, came to fulfill the law. And part of the fulfillment of the law was making and allowing and encouraging people to live in community. But religion of empire is different. Religion of empire is about power. It's just about power. It's about getting power and keeping power. Constantine, people like to hold him up as some sort of idol for, Christianity, but he was in favor of keeping power in the hands of government. That's all he really wanted. And so he constructed and made, some rules and some helped create the dogma, all right, around Christianity that Jesus did not do, that was designed to keep things in the order such as would protect the proliferation and the success and the survival of the empire. And it's all about building power. It's all about building power. So religion of empire is, I think, antithetical to the inherent message of Jesus. It's antithetical. It's not what Jesus taught. And I think when you read, like I was sharing a story, because we like mythicism, even in our reading and of the Hebrew scriptures.
Right.
And so I heard this wonderful breakdown by Renee August. She was breaking down how in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, Joseph, who, I grew up loving because, he was the guy who forgave his brothers after they did him so wrong.
Right.
And then he came to him but my goodness, when you read Genesis 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, you see how this man, Joseph, was co-opted by the Pharaoh who liked him. And when the drought was coming, and he knew the drought was going to come, he went around in Egypt and he collected food from all these people and he stored it in the coffers of the empire. And then when the famine came, he sold for people who were starving, who had grown the food, he sold them back. They could not get food to eat and not starve unless they bought it from the state. That's empire.
Yeah.
That's empire. Empire does not care about the lives of people. Empire cares about money and power. And that's the difference between two entities.
And they'll do whatever they have to keep it.
Exactly right.
They will. They will.
You also talk a little bit, you touched on this in just a moment ago, but how the church has turned Jesus from a dark-skinned Semitic person to light-skinned Aryan person with blue eyes. We've all seen those images. And I do feel like there's more and more talk lately of, turning him back into a historical Jesus. Do you think we're on the right path? Are we recasting him in his original culture? Talk to that, kind of where we are as a culture.
Well, I think there's a push-pull going there. Oh gosh, Jerry Falwell back in, I think, the 80s or 90s said Jesus was a he-man.
Yeah.
He was a he-man. And I've heard people say that, this whole thing about toxic masculinity, if you've read Jesus and John Wayne, you know what I'm talking about in terms of her description of Jesus. But he-man, strong, this toxic muscular masculinity. And people have said and are still saying, especially in different, circles, that the image of Jesus is too effeminate. You hear all of this language going on now, that the image of Jesus is too effeminate, and Christianity, as it has been taught, has made men too effeminate. And so even if there is a loud voice that is saying, that Jesus, he was a brown skin, he was Palestinian. If he was alive, you probably would not want him around. You'd probably call him a lib, you'd probably, or a lefty. But by the color of his skin, he would be a marginalized person. The people on who are describing him physically are not getting into his muscles, his masculinity, as they define his masculinity. They're getting into his ethnicity. And so I think that as they talk about that, his ethnicity, it may be making an impact on some people, but there is this loud, heavy push on the other side for people to regard Jesus as this strong John Wayne cowboy type guy who nobody messed with. That's the image that I feel like is coming and pushing through and making people who maybe are a little bit uncertain about what they think about Jesus go to that side.
Yeah. It was important for me to see, I don't know if you saw this or not, it was several years ago, Popular Mechanics, based upon the time, the culture, and the region, recrafted and re-imaged Jesus to what they thought would be historically accurate. And so you've got this little bitty guy, probably 5'2", curly brown hair. it just looked like a normal human being. And I thought that meant so much to me because, as an indigenous person, to see Jesus with brown skin and with his cultural identity, that was important for me. And so I think we've lost a lot in trying to whitewash Jesus to make us fit an image of empire and masculinity that's just not there. So go ahead.
Yeah, and it is the making of whiteness, which is a construct, right? It's a construct. I hear people who've gone to Africa say, when I'm in Africa, I don't see black people. It was a construct that was created by those who wanted to enslave people of African descent. And so then they made, they created this black white thing. And there's this whole story about, I forget the name of the guy, who was working even with indigenous Americans and just, classifying them as less than the white people who were coming and invading their land in order to justify their converting these so-called heathens into what they considered to be civilized. So they made whiteness the construct, the epitome for all that is good and right and smart and all of that. It's a construct. It's not even real. It has caused just an enormous amount of problems. It's just enormous. And people say, like, I have heard people say, everybody knows God was white. Duh. So
oh my gosh.
No, God is a spirit, and they who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. So where does it say he was white? Or it's the same mindset that says Megyn Kelly, I'll never forget. That's why I put it in the book. Everybody knows Santa, something she said are just true, and you just can't get away from it. God is white, Santa Claus is white, and that's it. And that's the mindset of a lot of people because of this construct that has been put in place to protect the color of a person's skin in order to empower him or them to marginalize other people. And America has done a very good job of denigrating people of color, especially Black people, all over the world.
Absolutely.
You talk about, going back to the beginning of our conversation about the Bible and the Constitution as two sacred documents. And you obviously show us how both of those documents have been used for personal gain and have been twisted to not provide justice for all people. And you cite Frederick Douglass in the book when he described the Constitution as a flawed document at war with itself. Accepting Douglass's statement as true, what can we now do to ensure the Constitution maintains the rights for all citizens? What are some practical things that we can do?
Well, here's the thing. I think in your question, there's a little bit of a problem with the verbiage because it has not been used to maintain the rights of all people. And so going back to Douglas's statement, I feel like, and I've heard many people say that there really needs to be a do-over. Now, interestingly, people who are Christian nationalists are saying there needs to be a do-over too. So wouldn't it be interesting if it worked out that since both sides want a do-over, there could be a new constitutional convention, because that's the only way a do-over could happen. But the Constitution as it is written and as it is interpreted and understood are two different documents. It's just really two different. It's just like people who are, I'm going to call traditional Christians and Christian nationalists, two different perceptions of Jesus, two entirely different understandings of the scriptures and what they say. So there has to be some kind of way, an intersection with the two opposing sides and get people to sit in a room. Wouldn't that be a mess? And to begin to deconstruct, just do it over. It's an old document. It is old. I mean, for people to say, I'm a constitutionalist, and the situation is so different now than it was when the document was created, that there needs to be, because it has never been able, this Constitution has never effectively been used, effectively and consistently, maybe I should say, been used to protect the rights of all people. If we go to Roe v. Wade, all right, so they wanted to protect the right of women to have abortions, and now that's undone. So the Constitution allows maybe some rights to come through in a so-called liberal spree, right, a liberal stretch, and then sooner or later, the other side comes and undoes it. So what can be done? What can be done to create a document that cannot be undone? What can be done in order to create a document that is just a document that will not be eroded or changed by political, persuasions. And I don't know how to do that, because politics is just a part of being alive. Politics is what drives the economy. And politics, I think, are more important to people than religion. Religion is used to support and justify politics, but politics is much more important to people than is religion, I think. So I don't know how we could do it, but I do know that this current document, as it is, needs to be done over, because it's not protecting the masses of the people. It's only protecting a very small group of people, most of whom are white and wealthy, but not all. Wealthy males, but not all. Mm-hmm. And it just needs to be redone so that there are some things in place that just really cannot be changed.
Yeah. And I've heard people talk about, and you mentioned it in your answer and description, is that I've got such a problem with those people who continue to promote original intent of the Constitution, because as you state in the book, if we go back to the original intent of the Constitution, well, then that leaves out African Americans, indigenous people, people with Hispanic descent, women. And it's all just white landowners that the Constitution applies to. And then I also heard someone say at one time that even the framers themselves would be disappointed if they returned today to see that we're still operating under the same Constitution that they wrote for, because Jefferson talks about a living Constitution that's always changing and morphing in regards to the people who are living in the country at that time. It needs to reflect the people of that time. And so, what you're saying, I think, is absolutely right and just, and something that certainly needs to be considered looking at this Constitution, because it is very, very problematic. So
it is. It is.
Well, Dr. Smith, I could really talk to you all day about this, and the book is just absolutely fantastic. Now, my last question for you before I turn it over to Missy is this. We have come a long ways as a society. And I remember the late Congressman John Lewis talking about the progress that we have made as a culture when it comes to confronting racism. But at the same time, we still have so far to go, and we only have to look at the headlines to realize that, and what's going on in our country and in the world. What can people of good faith do right now, today, to help bring about what Dr. King coined as that beloved community?
Well, last evening I did a training for a group of people in Florida who are serving as peacekeepers in these upcoming elections. And one of the things that I stress in that training, because it's for nonviolent resistance, is that Dr. King stressed that the work of nonviolence was about building community, which means that if you were opposing systems and not individuals, that you were not to look at the person who thinks differently than you as an enemy, but merely as an opponent. And he stressed that the biggest part of this work is to listen to other people. And, so sharing this with this group of people, and I've shared it with other groups of people we do this training with, that one of the hardest things you'll have to do if you're standing out on a pole line and somebody's being just totally obnoxious, the job of being a peacekeeper, which is not in the Bible, but peacemakers are the ones that are helping to keep the peace, is to listen to the person, because this is what I absolutely, totally believe, that in the beginning, the sovereign God made everything that was made. I believe that. I believe that throughout humanity, no matter your ethnicity, there are things that are the same. We cry for the same reasons. We ache for the same reasons. We argue about the same things. We're afraid of the same, there's a sameness about being human. And when we stop to listen to people, and in our listening, get them to be willing to listen to us, we find that commonality of humanity, the commonality that we have as human beings. And I have seen when I have tried to do that, because people can just make you so angry, you just want to slap the fire out of them just with that, and just be still and listen. And when you allow them to talk, because so many people feel unlistened to and dismissed, which accounts for a lot of the anger. When you allow them to get past that and they take a breath and then you say, I know exactly what you're talking about. It is amazing to see the change. There are stories from the civil rights movement that are just fascinating when people, angry people, dogs and hoses, had to stop because they finally saw some commonality between their own humanness and the humanness of the people who are fighting for justice. And so I think that what has to happen is there has to be a lot more on purpose, intentional listening, just listening to people, letting people talk, not arguing, but just listening and learning. And that's the only way that we get past some of the rancor and the toxic anger that is destroying us. If we can get somebody to say, well, shoot, I didn't know that. You go through that too? That's a milestone. And I think that's what happened during the civil rights movement. Not as much as needs to, but I think that's what happened then, which made for a more beloved community. And it's what needs to happen now. It absolutely needs to happen now because the leadership of the country is just taking us down a rabbit hole. It's just awful.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you.
Dr. Smith, thank you so much for talking to us today. The book is fantastic. It is With Liberty and Justice for Some, the Bible, the Constitution, and Racism in America. So Dr. Smith, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is There's More to Tell. In light of our conversation today and the work that you do, what is your more to tell?
I think that the more to tell is to further explore how all of these parts of this society have been complicit in keeping racism alive. So my next project is to go through some of the history of headlines on newspapers and media that have been used to support the church and the government in their proliferation and their pushing of racism. That's my project. Now, I think that we have to pay attention to every single thing, and the media and its headlines really do need to be examined.
Well, Dr. Susan Smith, thank you so much. She is the executive director of Crazy Faith Ministries, and her latest book, With Liberty and Justice for Some, the Bible, the Constitution, and Racism in America, is available at Judson Press. So make certain you check it out and buy a copy because it is outstanding. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hey listeners, check us out online at goodfaithmedia.org and follow us on social at gfmedia.org. We'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. I'm new here and could really use the feedback, but only if it's glowing. Thanks for listening.
My name is Laine Scales, and today I'm welcoming onto the pod Dr. João Chaves, my friend and collaborator. Dr. Chaves is Associate Director of Programming at Hispanic Theological Initiative, which is housed at Princeton Theological Seminary. And he's the incoming Assistant Professor of Evangelism and Mission at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He's also co-director with me on the Baptist Scholars International Roundtable, and we have the pleasure of leading a group of Baptist scholars from around the world meeting at Oxford each year. João is married to Dr. Claire Duffy, and they are the parents of two young people, Jonathan and Rebecca. Very important to this conversation, João is a native of Brazil and a Baptist who has migrated around the USA geographically, but also migrated, as many of us have, in his understanding of Baptist theology and ecclesiology. He is a two-time graduate of Baylor University with a Master of Theological Studies from Truett Seminary and a PhD from our Department of Religion at Baylor. Today, we want to talk primarily about his recent book, Migrational Religion, Context and Creativity in the Latinx Diaspora. And that's from Baylor University Press. But we're also going to touch upon a more recent book, which is from Mercer University Press, called The Global Mission of the Jim Crow South, Southern Baptist Missionaries and the Shaping of Latin American Evangelicalism. João, welcome. As always, it's good to be with you, and today we're in person. You and I often do so much of our collaboration by Zoom, and it's a bit unusual to be in the same space in person together.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation for this conversation, Laine. Again, it's for me, it's also a great pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to our talk.
Okay. Well, so you begin your preface to Migrational Religion with a bit of your own story, coming to the USA as a Baptist, and that was more than 20 years ago. So tell us a little bit about your own experience and why you think it's important to write about the Brazilian Baptist churches that we find here in the U.S.
No, thank you for the question. Yeah, it is. That is this, saying among historians that particularly what my graduate training was in, although I dabble in sociology a little bit, is that every history is autobiography. Mm-hmm. That might be overstated to an extent, but some of that is certainly true of my own experience. I became a Baptist in my teenage years, became a Christian in my teenage years in Brazil, in a church that was founded by Southern Baptist missionaries. But I always was very interested in, well, not always, but very soon became very interested into the dynamics of Latin American evangelicalism coming from a multi-faith family. And then when I migrated here, for work, went to a Brazilian Pentecostal church that was a part of, became worship leader in that church for a little bit. And the way in which the differences between the church of the Brazilian Baptists in Brazil and Brazilian immigrant churches here kind of struck me as very interesting. And I began kind of thinking, as I was always an avid reader. And I started reading about those dynamics early on, but also participated in those churches. And when I migrated to academia or to seminary and graduate studies, I started kind of encountering more of those differences in dynamics between religious communities in Latin America and the religious communities in the U.S. whose participants were mostly immigrants from Latin America, and that became an interest of mine in terms of study. Brazilian Baptist became the topic of my particular research that ended up in the book Migrational Religion, but I tried to contextualize that story from within a broader dynamic of really the way in which migration changes the religious imagination of immigrants from Latin America to the U.S. So the Brazilian Baptist is a case study. I had more access to those communities for different reasons that are outlined in the book, but I think that particular case studies kind of open up the possibility to discuss broader dynamics that are a part of the lives of immigrant communities in general. So although, again, I look at Brazilian Baptists specifically in the book, I believe that those dynamics can be extrapolated to have broader explanatory power that also speak to how migration and religion in the U.S., especially migration for Latin America, kind of intersects and develops in more general ways.
Mm-hmm. It's so important for us to understand as the U.S. changes so quickly. Well, one of the things I appreciate is the historical foundation that you laid for us, and that's, of course, one thing that we have in common. We both study Baptist history in the 19th and 20th centuries, and my focus is on women missionaries and social workers, and your focus, at least in this story, is those same SBC missionaries, Southern Baptist Convention missionaries, as they entered into Brazil, how their actions and their attitudes and so forth shaped the Brazilian Baptists. So could you recap for us briefly what came to pass as the SBC entered into Brazil?
I love that question because it kind of allows me to talk a little bit about the connection between the two books you mentioned, Migration and Religion and the Global Mission of the Jim Crow South. In some significant ways, they're kind of volume 1 and 2 of a similar trajectory, or at least a similar narrative arch. The Southern Baptist Convention missionaries, as I try to show primarily in in the Global Mission of the Jim Crow South, really are very successful in exporting, introducing and maintaining an SBC mentality, especially in terms of theological and social and political convictions, to their Brazilian converts or proselytes, as I call them in the book, and I make a distinction there in the book as well between those two terms. So they're very successful to an extent that when I end the Global Mission of the Jim Crow South, I say that despite notable exceptions and potential qualifications, in the end of the 1980s, which was when I end the narrative or the historical narrative of the book more precisely, Southern Baptists have been successful in kind of having Brazilian bodies with Southern Baptist minds. And I do mention a few qualifications to that because that could be overstated, but I think that is generally historically accurate. But that is upset. That mentality is upset by the complex dynamics of migrant communities, which is then transitioning to migration or religion. I follow those immigrants or Brazilian immigrants that form Brazilian Baptist churches here. Mm-hmm. So that allows me to look of how the church in Brazil develops, and then also seeing how those immigrants now, as a result of the new immigration law of 1965, where immigration really begin reshaping in significant ways and diversifying in the United States. We have these Brazilians migrating here, Brazilian Baptists trained within the Southern Baptist mentality. But the dynamics of migration itself kind of upset the particular dispositions that Southern Baptists have been very successful in establishing and maintaining in Brazil. So that's kind of generally how those two books connect. And the way by which the SBC has introduced and maintained their influence in Brazil has been via many means, but primarily by theological education, publication, and controlling initiatives of church planting, and being able to select leaders who would train to be the leaders of the denomination. In such a way that even today, in many seminaries, in Baptist seminaries in Latin America, but Brazil in particular, if you look at the curriculum, you see what you see in terms of the assigned books and the particular dispositions that professors try to teach their students into are translated from the U.S., are translated Southern Baptist materials. And that, again, it dissipates in certain ways, but very much is a part of what's happening by the time I end my narrative in the 1980s, but it also continues beyond that.
Well, one of the things I learned from you in that second book is that there was an enclave of Confederates who migrated to Brazil, and you lay out for us how white supremacy was really a part of what was exported by the missionaries and the enclave of Confederates along with the gospel. How did those dynamics play out within Brazil historically in those times?
I would make just a small distinction that missionaries, certainly, or Confederate exiles, certainly did not export racism to Brazil. When they arrived there, I mean, Brazil is already and continues to be a thoroughly racist country. As a matter of fact, it is because of that structural racism or partially because of their structural racism, that these Confederates go there to begin with.
Yes.
Right? So the war ends in 1865 in the U.S., and Brazil remains a slaveholding country until 1888. So 23 more years of legal slavery in Brazil, and a lot of these Confederate exiles are induced to go to Brazil because many of them want to recreate the Old South there. When they arrive, and so thousands of Confederates go to Brazil, and among them are Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, and so on. What complicates matters for them is that when they do arrive in Brazil, they notice that although slavery remains legal in the country, miscegenation happens to an extent that it didn't in the U.S., and some laws already begin to show more what they perceive as more leniency towards the Brazilian black population. For example, in 1870, you have the law of the free womb, in which now newborns were born into freedom. Beyond that, Brazilian slaves could buy their own freedom, and there's just a lot more miscegenation within the population that they were comfortable with. So many Confederates form the enclaves that you mentioned. It is on one of those enclaves that the first Brazilian Baptist Church began. The second Brazilian, I should say not Brazilian, but in Brazil, because they catered to Confederate exiles, the second one as well. And then in the 1880s, when this happens in the 1870s, in the 1880s, 1881 to be more precise, when the Bagbies go to Brazil, the missionary couple that began the sustainable phase of Brazilian Baptist missions. It is in those communities that mostly embrace them, although in 1882, they found a church with the Taylors, and by then the Teixeiras, also a family of Brazilians. They found the first Brazilian Baptist church that is intentionally formed to reach the local population. And that's the year that for a long time has been celebrated as the year where the Brazilian Baptist Church begins, 1882. But of course, those missionaries, the Bagbies, the Taylors, and the others that followed them, are by and large affected by this lost cause or Confederate mentality. And they are Southerners, and they have been socialized within that world. And that does not dissipate. As a matter of fact, when they go to Brazil, unlike many missionaries who go to other places in Africa and Asia, they see major parts of their racial imagination reinforced rather than challenged. Because Brazil already, again, as a white supremacist country with its own form of white supremacy, not the same, but nevertheless is there, already has this structured society based on this illusion that white people are superior and the black people are inferior. And that reinforces aspects of their own racial imagination, even though these two countries don't think about race in the exact same way. The general contours of the racial imagination with these white supremacist dispositions that whites not only do dominate society but should, it's there. And it reinforces and gives freedom for their own forms of racial superiority illusions to take place not only in their own personal lives, but structurally in the life of the denomination. And that happens via a number of different mechanisms that come into play.
Very good. Well, that history is so helpful for us to understand as kind of context and background the Brazilian migrants who come here to the U.S., establish churches, and I learned a new word through reading Migrational Religion, which is brazuca, which is the word that we use to describe Brazilian churches. So one of the issues that you raise in one of the later chapters is about undocumented Brazilians in the brazuca churches and the ebb and flow of the numbers of undocumented people attending these churches. Tell us a little bit about how one's status as documented or undocumented plays out in the Brazuca churches.
So yeah, the term brazuca, it's one that has been in the literature and especially in ethnography and sociological works on Brazilian immigrants to the U.S. And it basically means Brazilian immigrants here. That's how Brazilians many times refer to themselves, a kind of a grassroots term that is picked up by some academics later. And many, most Brazilian immigrants to the U.S. are undocumented. Many of them overstay their tourist visa. And so if you're going to this church, into Brazilian churches here, you either, you see a lot of that. And that's not only Brazuca churches, but other as well. It's a touchy, point. And when I write about that, I of course omit the identity of the people that that are either being interviewed or talked about. But it is a reality there, and it's very interesting because it is one of the points that put these churches that are often officially associated with the Southern Baptist Convention at odds with their own denominational history and denominational activity because of the traditional white Southern Baptist support of folks like Trump and others who have a particular stance on immigration policy. The way that affects that plays out in these churches is by, again, putting them at odds with what would be their more socially conservative dispositions. And what I show in the book, I trace how these pastors really develop this sensitivity towards their congregants or parishioners once they experience and understand what they're going through. So most pastors of these churches come here being educated in Brazilian seminaries and on religious visas. So there's a distinction between the pastors and parishioners there. Mm-hmm. So whereas a lot of the parishioners are or have been undocumented in these communities, most pastors are not and have not been undocumented. And they come, as I mentioned in the book, armed with religious visas and moralistic dispositions.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
To be faced with communities that are really not in the same place, right? And I trace how that affects and changes the journey of these pastors. So one of the pastors in the book that I mentioned, when he came, he actually called Immigration Service. He had such a shock that he called the immigration to ask, what do I do? My church has a lot of undocumented. What do I do now? And the immigration officer told him, pastor your sheep and let us deal with,
Right.
let us deal with that, what you're doing, kind of, which was very interesting. Another pastor who, again, and one thing that I comment in this book is that these dispositions or these shifts, they have transnational implications because a lot of these pastors, they write in the denominational publications that come out in Portuguese in Brazil. And one of the pastors that I mentioned, he has a column on the Jornal Batista, which is the flagship kind of denominational publication, and he comes to, after having been pastor of a large church in Brazil, after having been president of state conventions in Brazil, he comes to pastor a church in Florida. And he really documents, and this is one of the story I tell, but this representative of many others. He really documents, when he showed up, what he thought about that, very conflicted. And then he moves to being very conflicted about, the kids who came without papers, now they can't go to college. So he then focuses on those. He develops a heart to kind of, there's something wrong about that, right? And then he goes on to everyone. He's like, wait a minute, eventually he was like, I cannot pastors these people if I don't side with them theologically, if I don't side with them morally, if I don't side with them politically. And one of the pastors come to say, you know what, I believe that, we shouldn't have borders. So they go to borderlessness, imagination from a very kind of particularly conservative stance. There's a shift to the extent that one of the pastors actually said from the pulpit who his congregation should vote for, and he wasn't the Republican candidate. Particularly because he said, and then I asked this pastor, aren't you scared to lose your 501c3 status because now you're giving explicitly political support to a candidate? He said, no, I'll pay any price for my people, right? So you really see that shift happening in many of them. And with that, I try to offer this reflection of another puzzling thing that I hope to develop in the future, which is this idea that evangelicals think themselves as law-abiding citizens, as American evangelicals particularly, as if that was necessarily something to be praised. Especially in a nation in which very few years ago you still had the segregated South, right? As a legal reality, in a place that has been challenged to deal with its own ghosts in terms of its benefits from the slave trade. And I mean, I can just cite so many laws that this happens in Brazil too, but mentioning the U.S. context, that Americans in general, but white Americans in particular, should be ashamed of, and yet they sometimes are, especially in the context of the SBC, which is the context of these churches, they seem to be so proud of being law-abiding citizens. And that seems like a precarious disposition to me, especially looking at these communities. And I think that this discussion about and this kind of observations and the study on undocumented workers gave me kind of a segue to speak about this notion that being law-abiding citizens is a good thing. It seems to me strange to go there for historical reasons, but for many other reasons. And I think these pastors realized that eventually, that the law is really not an ideal standard on where to hang your hat, on which to hang your hat, if you're siding with marginalized communities. The laws many laws anyway, were developed to benefit a particular kind of people, and it's not them. And I think it takes a while for pastors to realize that.
And what a treasure to be able to have these writings of the pastor as they evolve and as the pastor considers the law in relation to the people that he's shepherding. It reminds me that a big focus of migrational religion is bringing to fore the voices that have often been marginalized, and you did that by interviewing leaders and lay people in Brazuca churches. Tell us a little bit about those interviews and what the experience of talking to the people personally did for your research.
The couple of things that I think were impactful and important in that process was doing three things. I was looking at three basic kind of stream of sources. One, going to churches across the U.S., I did archival work in many churches, meaning I look at their church minutes, I look at the bulletins that in the pastoral messages that were archived that pastors left behind. So that was kind of that was documented. So that was part of it. I also heard many sermons. I also look at official denominational publications, sometimes in Brazil, sometimes here, that these pastors were publishing. And then also, of course, observed many services across the U.S. in these churches and interview pastors and leaders. Now, it was, of course, a fascinating experiences. But what struck me particularly, and again, it goes back to this theme of being impacted by shifting mentalities because of the of makeup of immigrant congregations. And it's when I interview pastors who are here for, say, 3 years or less, most of them were still very much, that traditional Baptist mentality that they have been taught in Brazil. That is very close to a Southern Baptist imagination. But pastors who are here have been here for a longer time. You could see that they were much more flexible about their theological approaches, and sometimes even resentful of the denomination that they were still officially a part of, meaning the Southern Baptist Convention. So, for example, when I have one chapter in what I call ethnic denominationalism, that I talk about the convention that Brazilian Baptist churches kind of began, because they really think that the leaders of that convention really thought that they saw an ethnic cooperation rather than a cooperation from within the Southern Baptist Convention as being the ideal place, or at least the place in which real cooperation between them could happen. And some of them wanted to be connected to the Brazilian Baptist Convention rather than to the Southern Baptist Convention, or at the least to both, because they thought that they could have only authentic denominational cooperation within, or outside of the way in which the Southern Baptist Convention operated. So I talk a little bit about the dynamic of these pastors here, who now, with churches that have a budget in dollar and then the exchange rate come into play, because if they are contributing to the Brazilian Baptist Convention, the exchange rate changes things, right? Mm-hmm. And they are trying to pressure officials in the Brazilian Baptist Convention to change their bylaws, which say that only churches in the Brazilian territory can be a part of the Brazilian Baptist Convention. They're trying to transnationalize that, to say if you're a Brazilian church anywhere, you can be a part of that.
So thank you for sharing this really important story with us. At Good Faith Media, we have a tagline, which is, "There's more to tell." And so I would want to ask you, what's your more to tell for our audience today?
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that I would mention that the story of that I'm trying to tell is certainly a story about missions, about migration, and about colonialism. But it is important to remember that colonialism has its conservative expressions, which are the ones that I study and write about here. But it also have what appear to be more benevolent expressions coming from the progressive side. Mm-hmm. Right? So what we have many times, and I show some of these instances in the book, is we have these ideological struggles happening in the US, or in the US in Europe, that sometimes manifest themselves also in places like Latin America via the influence of missionaries and those who represent their resistance, but in ways in which many times both sides of the spectrum are trying to have translated versions in other places. And I say this only to note that although the focus of this study is on the conservative side of these colonial dispositions the U.S. missionaries bring to the global South, but in this case particularly to Latin America and Brazil, there are also progressive manifestations of that. So to take this criticism as some kind of self-righteous defense or blanket defense of progressive dispositions is not what is intended to do. So I just want to highlight that.
For sure. And, in that way, we all have something to learn from your story. It's a cautionary tale.
That's right.
For all of us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing what is, I know, a very personal story for you through these two books. And again, I'll name them. That's Migrational Religion, from Baylor University Press, and Global Mission and the Jim Crow South from Mercer University Press. And as we close, I'm just going to say a personal word after knowing you for 7 or 8 years now, first as a growing scholar and teacher at Baylor, and now as my co-laborer in the BSIR, that I recognize the ways that you're listening so carefully to your calling, and I know that scholarship is an important part of your calling. And while life hasn't always been kind to you, I've seen you be faithful and enduring some of the curveballs that have come your way. You're faithful in your journey and in carrying out that calling. So I'm grateful to you for sharing yourself with us a little bit today.
Well, thank you very much, Laine. And you know how grateful I am for your own mentoring and accompaniment throughout all those years. I really do appreciate that. And it's a privilege to be with you, continuing the journey. So thank you for inviting me for this conversation. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.